first of all, I'd like to say how much this community appreciates that the university bringing its roadshow here once again.
Hear, hear.
Intellectual barrenness here in the North Jackson. We lift our spirits and our hearts like honey. We thank you. Hope it continues. But it seems to me the theme that you've talked about, the consistent thing that you've all talked about is the future. We're talking about what's going to get us there better, more efficiently, and improve our future lives in a difficult, challenging world.
Okay.
Anyway, that's just an observation. I don't know. You know, we've all talked in your own ways about the future.
Okay. Any of us want to mention our common theme of future? Okay. Joe's observation was essentially that what he sees as what is common is that all of our speakers have spoken about the future and how to guide and to try to shape the future, or how the future is already being shaped. And so I was wondering if any of our speakers would like to elaborate on that question a little bit.
Sure, we can elaborate a little bit. I'll elaborate as a faculty member here and administrator, lay out the parameters of academic freedom in the sense that there are more defined and less defined than what we think, and it's, I think, it's very clear in something like climate change that it becomes vitally important for academic freedom, at the same time regulated by peer review. And what that means is you're free to say what you want to say, but you have peers who essentially monitor what it is you can get away with. And the whole process of peer review is something that I think is a vital part of academic freedom. And I think it's a vital part of moving science forward to understand something is controversial and potentially society changing as climate change. If you recall back last year, there was Climate Gate. I don't know if you remember this, with the emails floating around and the different scientists talking to each other, and essentially it revealed that scientists are people too. And there's nothing more catty than a group of academicians together in terms of trying to rip apart each other's ideas. So as long as we have academic freedom and we have peer review, in the sense that we do have some competition about ideas, then to me, you know, the future and the ability to understand what's coming ahead towards us can only be enhanced. Sometimes it's ugly process. Usually the peer review, you never get to see that part of it. I think the Climate Gate was a peek behind the curtain to see some of that cattiness business, but I think it's vital.
I might just second Jay's emotion by saying that the status quo is the way it is because of really, I'm going to say, a constellation of people interested in keeping things the way it is. So there's always a vested interest in the status quo. The paradox is that we know that the status quo can't last. Change will happen. And the real question, I think, for society is, how do we do this? Do we just let it happen, or do we create the future by deliberately thinking about it in open ways? And the tension that I think universities and other educational institutions face is the tension that, well, there is serious investment in the status quo, and so these ideas that come up about how we might create a future different than the present are always going to run into some opposition. And that's fair enough. We have to be open to to the opposition and to the expressions of dissent. And the only way to do it, I think, as Jay is pointing out, is to have a pretty rigorous peer review process. People can say what they want, but there has to be pretty rigorous examination, and you're held responsible for the validity of what you say.
I'm thinking of how different the web is. That people say all sorts of things with no check all the time. And then it's really interesting to see what gets picked up. So all of a sudden, even though all these scientists say climate change is happening, because there's so much muck out there, people begin to cite that Rush Limbaugh begins to cite his friend who cites him. I mean, like all of a sudden, then the power of citationality becomes confusing. And so I think the question of, with this surplus of information that we're all getting, how do we make sense of it? And clearly, nationally, we're still struggling with that. And that comes up all the time with Obama's questions like, is he a Muslim and is he not a Muslim? We have facts that it seemed as if factually that have been disproven, yet because there's so much information out there, how do we make sense of that? And I think that those are really pressing questions about how we figure out what we do. And I think those are questions that we are all struggling with. We in the academy think about that, but these are questions, all of the issues we've talked about. How do you have a civil conversation? It's a really pressing question. What do we talk about climate change? Those are questions that when we talk about with our students are really pressing issues. An argument does not mean Geraldo throwing a chair over someone's back. You know, when you talk about argument and discourse, what students see in their common every day might be very different than what we're trying to cultivate as a civil society. So how do we think about those things? And the availability of information and what we do with all the information out there seems to be something that's a question for all of us.
Before I ask the next question, I'd like to take one of my moments to throw in a comment, which is that this issue of civility, largely guaranteed by closet peer review or quiet peer review, and versus what happens on the internet, and this issue of how do you have a civil conversation is something that's very much at the forefront of thinking here in Wyoming. The Wyoming Humanities Council is actually running a 2-year set of forum conversations called Civility Matters, to discuss how do we talk to each other, how do we have civil conversations about very serious issues where there are passions deeply held on both sides. So I've flagged for you to watch for the Wyoming Humanities Council and its efforts in this. Anyway, with that little promo, any other questions? Okay, Marcia, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm interested in, I'm segueing a little bit, interested in the future of learning, and particularly Mary P. and the rest of you. How might current learning theory research intersect with what is happening that you described this morning?
So Marcia's question was what does the future of learning look like, and how are changes in the way people are learning affecting how we're thinking and researching those questions? That's a pretty big question. I'm not exactly sure I can answer all of it. But coming from the Pew Charitable Trust, and they have something called Internet in American Life, and they put out a report like you would not believe, like every 2 months. And they are constantly doing research, and it's fascinating, and it's very easy to read. So it's all free. If you're interested in that sort of thing. MacArthur Foundation information is all free. For the information on how quickly things are turning around, those are great places to take a look. They don't have much on maybe necessarily policy or pedagogy. They have a lot of facts about trends, and then they have big picture statements. But those would be great places if you want to learn something more about those. But the Pew Charitable Trust talks about how varied things are. But they're really talking about something called a participation culture. And the digital divide in the last decade was all about who had access to a computer and who didn't. And they're saying that that's actually not the divide anymore. Lots of places have access, but it's a culture of participation that's really quite different. And if you really know how to be part of this participatory culture, it's the invisible, or what they're calling the hidden curriculum, that will make you just feel like you fit in better in management as opposed to an entry-level position. And it's those invisible cultural things that it's on digital participation. People who are not just reading blogs, but actually creating them. People who are in networks and are talking to each other, who are working out problems informally. They're developing those invisible skills that will serve them very well. And that's what they're calling the hidden curriculum. So actually what they're saying, what is serving people particularly well is not necessarily being taught in schools. So that makes it even harder to assess, because how do you get in people's bedrooms or in other rooms and examine, and how do you read back from a textual trace? So those are actually the educational questions. How do we figure out what's going on in people's everyday until we can have education catch up with the extra curriculum? And they're thinking the extra curriculum is really much more closely in tune with contemporary practice than the stated curriculum, just because things take so long to change. So how are we getting at that extra curriculum? And there's a lot of informal, not informal, a lot of ethnographic work on people in community settings. That sort of educational practice is really where I think the true education for those sorts of the hidden curriculum, where that's being taught. And so I think that's a little harder to get at, but I think that's where the interesting innovation is happening. I don't know.
One of the truisms today is that students come to the classroom expecting for it to be a more participatory environment, more collaborative. That's what they're accustomed to, and they have access to giving voice to their ideas that they're already accustomed to through social media as well. The thing I think we all have to remember, though, at a place like UW is that in Mary P's classroom, as collaborative as the learning may be, there's one expert in the room and a bunch of students. And we need to maintain an environment where the students can learn from the expert. I'm not going to say that Mary P. or I or Jay or Paul don't learn when we're in the classroom or when we're thinking about what we're going to do in the classroom. But students come to a university expecting to find experts in the classroom, and we need to make sure that that's what they get.
I just want to follow up on that. I'm teaching a class called Digital Storytelling, and I thought there was going to be a lot of expertise. And I canceled class one day and had a straight up writing workshop. I'm like, this is what an introduction looks like. This is how you make a transition. And I didn't think I would have to make that as in a senior level class. And I discovered that really those core skills, it's hard to learn. They're not getting as much practice as we would hope. And so as much as this collaboration is there, there's also often very directive. This is what this looks like. You need to learn the conventions and the genres of your stated and future profession, and it's going to be hard up. This is a topic sentence. This is how you introduce a quote. And I was surprised at how very directive and didactic I was in a senior level class, but I was, and it was really needed. So I think it's not at all a free for all. It's trying to figure out things are new, things are changing, and what is remaining the same. And how do we figure out the both of those, the balance of the both?
Go ahead.
I actually just thought of a way to get all three of you involved, and perhaps all four of you. I wonder about economics right now. Economics, the current economic situation. Our students, our children who are in school, and right now what we're hearing about, looking to the future, is that there are no jobs for them. And we can all see, looking out there, that there are not jobs for a whole lot of people, older as well as younger, who may have various skill levels. We seem to have lost a 5 to 10% chunk of our population recently. Our young men, the ones 18 to 25, more than 25% of them, even among the Caucasians, are unemployed at this point. So looking toward the future, looking at the role of a university in Wyoming, I mean, I don't want my son on the oil rigs, thank you. It's very dangerous. Where are we going and how are we adapting so that we can serve our youth as well as preserving a living something along the line of what we've become used to for the rest of society.
Could you say that in one sentence?
No, I really can't.
I'm thinking, did everybody hear her by any chance? Or do I need to repeat it in some way? Okay.
I'll complicate that question and I'll let these guys try to answer it.
There's a
And
different
so,
component to it too.
but there was a statistic that came out of the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics that it was like in 2006. It said something like 82% of the jobs of that year's kindergartners had not yet been created.
Yes.
And so I think creating an educational system for a particular job is no longer viable. I mean, that was kind of the 20th century. We're all on an assembly line. You have math from 8 to 9, English from 9 to 10. We're all little widgets. But that's not going to work. And so figuring out, this goes back to the meta. People need to be able to task it, but they need to have these meta, high-order skills that they can transfer. And that was the whole buzz of learning how to learn and things of that nature. And so I think that what we're thinking about are certainly, you have to be a specialist in your area, but you also have to have that meta ability to transfer information to a variety of things. And the jobs that are here are, and Gary, the still production is still the same as it was in 1970. It's just done with 4% of the workforce. And so all the rest of it's been automated. So it's not like we're having less steel, we're just having fewer workers in that area. So you don't want to be training people for an automated, repetitive job. How do we help them to think about creativity and innovation? How do we help to think about those other abilities that are able to handle the complex problems that are today's problems and our future problems, and how do we think about them complexly, as opposed to when we make it so simple, real life isn't that simple. So my point more, and hopefully they'll have more direct answers, is there's no magic job that's gonna stay. There are some skills that we're gonna need that can't be offshored or automated, and how do we create industry or knowledge work around those sorts of skills.
That was a great answer. If I get any more specific, you're gonna have to vote for me for governor or something, because creating jobs, I mean, that is creating students who fill jobs. First day in class, I say, you're not here to learn anything from me. You're here to learn how to learn. And we spend the whole semester dissecting problems and breaking them apart and putting them into pieces and putting them back together, just like we build a watch. But it's all about ideas. It's taking ideas apart, reconstructing them, see if they work, spin them around, and it's all done floating around up here in some ether. And the notion being that I can't train you to be an economist, but I can train you how to think like one. I can train you how to take a problem apart, because the second thing I tell them after that is nobody's going to pay you to solve easy problems. And so let's go ahead and strip this down and figure out what you can do, because you are going to find problems you're interested in. You're going to do a way better job at it. When I came out of school in 1980, we were in sort of the same boat, same type of high unemployment, same idea of, and I came out thinking I was going to be an economist, and I ended up being a trapper. Right? That job had been invented. And it was not the job I anticipated having, but it was the one that I got. So after that, I decided, well, the students have to be prepared for whatever comes, and the best way to do it is to get them to figure out how to take ideas apart on the fly and put them back together so that they operate better, and somebody will pay you for that. Or the College of Business has now started an entrepreneurial program in which they really try to push the students to create your own job. Create your own job. You're the entrepreneur. And they've set up competitions, the 10K competition. For a long time I thought it was a race. But, they give $10,000 to the students who have the best entrepreneurial idea in the college to really trigger that sort of, do-it-yourself mentality.
Myron, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, I don't know if I have anything really original to add. Alfred North Whitehead, who was a British philosopher, said the task of the university is to create the future. And that's an idea that's really worth thinking about in some depth. We don't necessarily prepare people for specific jobs. I know it seems like we do sometimes. We graduate people with a Bachelor of Science in nursing degrees and so forth and so on. But we do more than that, actually. We create a different future in which there will be different jobs. And then at the same time, we have students at all different levels who I hope, if we're integrated enough amongst ourselves, we're preparing to occupy some of those jobs, not by teaching them skills that they'll need on the first day. But a good example of creating the future that makes some connection with an issue that you raised about working on an oil rig in Wyoming is that, well, working in an oil rig is working in a field where right now Wyoming's oil fields are really in declining production. Most of them have, the easy oil is all gone. But guess what, 60 to 70% of the oil that was originally there is still there. And we can think about the kinds of technologies that might be available, physical principles and chemical principles and so forth, that might help us go after that oil in those existing fields where many of the environmental impacts have already been felt. At the same time, though, we have to, that kind of research has to enter our classrooms so that students graduate understanding I'm going to say the high-level principles that they will need to work in those oil fields of the future, where it's not just going to be how fast can you get pipe in the ground, but there'll be other higher-level considerations. So it's this complex web of creating the future by creating the sort of the future knowledge base that we'll have, and preparing students to acquire that knowledge base as they go through their lives. Now I've spent this whole time talking about jobs and everything else that we might consider the university preparing students for. But I'm going to say, this is going to sound old-fashioned and romantic, the university also prepares people not just for their jobs, but to lead richer lives. So that when issues come up in society, we can have intelligent conversations about them, and not just beat each other over the heads with them, as seems to be pretty common these days. Talk radio, visits by university speakers, and so forth seem to generate far more angst and distress than they really need to. In a society where people's lives were richer, we'd have deeper conversations amongst ourselves than we typically do.
Yes, sir.
I just suggest that maybe the idea of jobs is being not quite defined the way I would think about it. And if what you want to do is train people to be creative and critical thinkers, and they'll figure out a job. I mean, in fact, this valley is full of people for whom there was no appropriate job, and yet one way or another we managed to figure out a way to stay alive. A great treat in my freshman physics course was the first day, the first lecture, 300 kids in a bolted, every seat was bolted down, but it didn't matter. And they said, take out your textbook, which was Halliday and Rosby, and open it to page 325. And on the right-hand side, third paragraph, second line down, there's a sentence that says, it is not possible to create a beam of collimated light. Take out a red pencil and draw a line through that. That is no longer true. But the laser had just been invented. And that kind of thing, and that's where I think, going back, Myron, to what you were talking about, I think it is part of the role of the university to present nonsense to the kids. And let them figure out that it's nonsense. In Virginia, where we now are in the news sphere, the state just adopted a textbook for fourth graders that said, among other things, Stonewall Jackson had 2 brigades of black soldiers in his army. And it took several weeks before it was realized that this was nonsense. And unfortunately, I don't think that they have addressed all the students and said, open your book to page 67 and draw a line through that sentence, which would be the minimum approach. But having the kids exposed to nonsense, or to, whether it's controversial nonsense, or, you know, you mentioned Shockley, which I thought was a very, very apt, you know, historical example. A brilliant man who did brilliant, brilliant stuff, and then sort of got off into a corner. But listening to him and then deciding, okay, he's off in a corner and this is wacko, even though he's not brilliant stuff, that's an important intellectual thing. And if the author of this unfortunate textbook had maybe done a little more of that, a lot of trouble could have been saved. So I think jobs is a very broad thing, and I think that going back and teaching kids to write and express ideas and then analyze them critically. If you all get that done, earn your pay.
When I was a graduate student, I heard an expression that stuck with me. Our work is more than our job, and our life is more than our work. And I think that we should remember that when we're going to the university and when we're teaching in the university. There are people's jobs, and their work is a bigger sphere, and their lives are actually a bigger sphere. And we ought to be looking at the whole sphere, the biggest sphere possible.
Yes.
I'd just like to say an accolade or two to you people here. I can brag a little bit. I had both my sons graduated from university. One of them was a petroleum engineer, the other was an accountant and a lawyer, and they did a very good job down there. I think the whole state of Wyoming ought to be very proud of what you people are doing down there. Just keep up the good work. You're doing marvelous. I'd like to hear more of it. Thank you very much.
Please.
Can I go back to climate change for a minute? What motivated the populations of Norway and Sweden to take climate change as seriously as they apparently have? And is there a way to better engage Americans and actually other people through the web? I mean, is it being exploited to the full possibilities and you know, trying to make people understand, to help people understand the issues better, and what more creative could be done?
The question was, why are the Swedes and Norwegians so engaged in climate change, and whether and how to engage a broader population. I can't totally explain. I mean, I'm Swedish and Norwegian, so I can't totally explain it because I live it. But to a certain degree, they've taken on they've been very aggressive in social policy, whether it's immigration or political rights, and climate change is seen as one of those social, almost human right type issues. And they have invested a lot of energy. It's not that every Swede or Norwegian agrees with every policy that's enacted, but for the most part, the population and their political process has said that this is a serious question that threatens them. And if indeed the Gulf Stream changes, it will really affect them, because you know they go back to another ice age up there potentially, even if it's warming, because we don't know where things are going to get colder or warmer or drier or wetter. Things are going to change all around the globe. In terms of engaging the population, this is a very interesting question, because the scientific communities that I put up on the slideshow, the different associations, those groups are all about peer review, and it's all about trying to find the hard science and taking your lumps from your colleagues as they review your work and go through and find all the flaws, and you try again and you try again, and they end up in the published literature. And a lot of times the weight of that scientific knowledge is put up against someone who's looked at the data a different way but has not convinced anyone other than themselves that this data is right. And it hasn't gone through peer review, but it's well, let's put it this way. A bad idea, well articulated, goes a long way. And it takes a time before it gets pushed down. And so I know we've had these discussions in Wyoming before, and we've had different conferences where we brought out people to talk pros and cons and ups and downs of climate change, and bringing the peer review and having that debate, and then having someone who's studied the data on their own and has not had anyone else agree with them gets equal footing. And so then the general public really may or may not understand how to sort those two out, and what is this peer review anyway, and aren't you guys, all you scientists, in cahoots? I guarantee we're not in cahoots. We can't stand each other most of the time. The debates get pretty personal, even though they don't try to. It's really about the ideas. You can find different websites. The Pew Center also has a center on climate change. There are lots of sources of information out there. But then there are lots of sources of what I would now call disinformation. And those have sometimes bigger platforms, and they're oftentimes funnier. And humor works.
I'd agree with Jay about how do you figure out what information is accurate. And I think that although the web allows people everywhere to see everything, people turn to the things they like. So people who want to watch Fox News, and people who want to listen to maybe CNN would watch CNN. And so there's a balkanization of where information is coming from. And consequently, people turn to what they already believe to have that confirmed that they were right. And so I think there's actually less conversation going on. I think there's more reaffirming that you're right. And I don't know if there are a lot of platforms of where these conversations where you're genuinely walking in, open to giving your point and open to hearing the other point. I think conversations are really, I'm going to prove why I'm right. And I think the web allows you to do that. So you go to your types of sites, and the media allow you to do that. You're going to go to your particular news channel, or however that works out. Or you're going to go to Jon Stewart and skip the news altogether. And so, so there are a lot of options out there. But I think people go to, I don't know if I hear a lot of people who are open for the conversation. And sometimes if I ask someone a follow-up question, they can give me one level deep. And I say, well, why is that? And then there's really nothing underneath. And I think there's so much information out there. It's really hard to keep on top of everything. I was trying to read my insurance policy. I have a PhD in language, literacy, and rhetoric. And I'm like, really? I'm on page 87 and I can't figure out if I'm covered, you know? And so I think we're all supposed to have a lot of information about a lot of things. So we defer that to whom we consider experts. But too often those experts are just reaffirming what we already believe. So I don't really know if I would actually say the increase in number of news outlets is not helping actually with this conversation. And so it's working in an inverse way than you might originally think. You can get that information. I don't think many people do. I don't think many people genuinely listen to the opposing side to get in-depth conversation, which might be all the more reason why we need a real forum for the university to have that.
Are there any questions from further in the back? I realize I'm only seeing people in front of me. Okay, I'll look at yes.
Well, I don't know that I can focus on that question, but what you were just saying, leads back into the idea of the importance of not only inviting a full range of speakers on various topics to the university, but having people show up willing to listen. I mean, you've all said that over and over again. And in your talk about the media, though, about web use in education, one of the things I've been trying to get my head around is if the university is generally the leader toward the future and in innovative ideas, etc., this seems to be an arena where we're all sort of desperately just trying to catch up to this hurtling train, figuring that if we jump on board, we might be able to manipulate its direction somehow. But it strikes me that some of the skills that you're talking about that are necessary in terms of communicating civilly, those aren't going to be learned by isolated interactions on the web, because it's been mentioned that it's easy to blog, or it's easy to have random comments that have, you know, no repercussions at all, to actually sit down with someone face to face, or have conversations where you're disagreeing with someone in the flesh and you have to accept all that comes with that. Those kinds of things I see computers used more and more in our elementary schools. I guess that's where I'm getting to. And it seems to me that even though those are important tools, the kind of skills that we really need to be developing, I just don't think can be developed in that platform. And I'm wondering, as you're talking about your work in using web in education, are you thinking the whole range, or are you specifically talking about students who are already at levels where they're thinking critically and creatively?
I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of question. I think that if you actually have a real audience, if people challenge you, then you are forced to rethink certain things. And so I think it can work both, not even both, all sorts of ways. And so I think that if you use, I think there's nothing inherent about technology. I think you can use, if you want to have worksheets, then you can put them on a computer and they can be worksheets. I mean, like you can just recreate old models. But if you want to do something different, you can also do that in the classroom. It's not like the technology is the only way to do it. But I do know if students have a real audience, and it's going to be seen by 4 million people, they figure it out. And they spend a lot more time working on it. And so I taught a class called The Rhetoric of Activism. And I teach it every couple of years. And one year I thought it was going to be all about the Supreme Court nominees, and then Katrina happened. And then the whole class changed. But then the last time I taught it, somebody did a project. They have to do a midterm, which is a very formal academic paper, use a method, discourse analysis, to analyze these texts and do something like that. In the end, they have to create a document that I call Does Work in the World. Some people write grant proposals, some people, they do all sorts of different things. This particular person was interning at the Wyoming Women's Foundation, and she said that the Wyoming Women Foundation materials are all sent to women 40 or over, because they think that's probably when women are starting to make money. And so she's like, but you're missing a whole demographic of people with no money, but a lot of time and activist zeal. So she wanted to create a YouTube that they could put on a Facebook account. So she created a Facebook account and put a YouTube clip up there. And it was very rhetorically savvy. She had to write an argument about why she made the modal choices she made, why this music, why this sort of argument. It was very savvy. And she spent so many hours on that project because it was going to be used and it was going to be up. And she had to engage with all sorts of people who might oppose this view, and she had to work with the Wyoming Foundation, Women's Foundation. That person spent far more time on that class assignment doing high order rhetorical analysis and then producing it in a way that a research paper would not have gotten that. So that's a situation in a college level classroom. And I think appropriate grade level things all the way through can do that sort of work. So my kids go to a public school called the Lab School in Laramie. And there's something called Pay It Forward, where you have to raise money for some particular thing. And I think they could do a lot digitally for that. They could figure out all sorts of things that they wanted to do. And so I think that it is not unique to higher grades. It's not unique to technology. They do that project without technology. So if you're going to use technology, you don't want it to be a one-off. You want it to be a way of thinking about new opportunities. But if it's just one-off assignment, then it doesn't really make sense. And so I do think that technology can help in those things, but not only in those ways. And I do think one of the ways technology can help is having a very real audience that makes students take ownership of what they're doing and makes them think they can make an impact in the world. And with that, they become invested in finding solutions.
I see a hand over here. Yes.
What would each of you consider to be the most influential or thought-provoking book you've ever read and why?
Okay, what's the most influential thought-provoking book that you've read? Tell us a little bit about it. Give you a moment to think.
What?
Most of us don't think in terms of the best book, think in terms of a.
Or one of, not necessarily the.
Right. You literally pick the Bible?
Yeah, well, I know the book that's been the most influential that I've never read, The Wealth of Nations, by Adam Smith. Every time I start it, it falls asleep. It's just written in such an old, style. But I get the gist. Self-interest regulated by competition. There, that's it. It's a lot crammed into one idea. But I would say when I was a lot younger, the one book that for some reason stuck, and it's probably because I wasn't really ready for it, is my uncle gave me this book when I was getting on a bus from Raleigh, North Carolina to Duluth, Minnesota. He said, "Read this," and it was Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And by the time I got to Duluth, I was so confused that I went back to school. And ever since, it's one of the ones that have just said, you choose to believe things. Why do you choose to believe them? And after I realized that I had a choice, then I started to accept the fact that I could make sense out of different things and then ask other people why they choose to believe things.
I don't think I can answer the question, because there's not a single book that I think has been most influential. I'll tell you, there is one book, though, that I have had a running quarrel with my entire adult life. It's a book that I read as a sophomore in college by a British analytical philosopher named A.J. Ayer. And his, the title, he wrote a lot of things, but the book that I read that I've been quarreling with is Language, Truth, and Logic. And it, at the time that I was 20 years old, it was a bewitching book. I thought that, I thought that it settled a lot of questions for about 2 weeks. And ever since then, I've really, just been in sort of a quarrel with the book. It seemed to, this was the sort of the crystallizing statement of the philosophical movement of logical positivism, and which is not very popular anymore among philosophers. But it is sure worth the quarrel, and I'll probably go to my grave arguing with that book, and in many cases unsuccessfully.
And I don't think I have a book, but I do have a class in college, and it was a small seminar, and it was a year-long class, and it was like the great questions, and it was like man and technology, and man and nature, and man and God, and I went to Notre Dame, and there were a lot of men, and I was like, "Where's a woman?" But I did remember being in that small seminar and having people truly invested in good faith conversation and be at completely opposite perspectives. And it was learning how to engage with an idea and with other people who disagreed with you in a good faith way. And it was probably the closest thing to the university as a civil forum that I've participated in teaching how to do that. And so I don't know if I have a particular book, but a way of engaging with a book or with other people who believe this truth about this book. And I think that was probably, so it's more like, what can you do with this was probably, because I don't have a particular book, but that class maybe.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Have we solved the world's problems?
I went to a liberal arts college, and it was college years were wonderful. They were like this, where you're engaging in this kind of dynamic conversation, the midnight philosophy on the meaning of life, and I was being taught to learn, and I was being taught to, and then I left school, and probably until 60, it didn't happen again. You were kind of looking for it But it didn't happen at cocktail parties, and it didn't happen in the supermarket aisle when you encountered a friend, and it didn't happen on a shopping trip, and it happens again if you find just the right people in the right circumstances. Somebody mentors you in it, and suddenly, you know, your life journey and your story comes to life. But you know, how do we create, here's another small question, how do we create, you know, that maybe this is not the question, maybe when you talk about the bigger picture in life, we lose that when we leave an academic experience, or many people have never had that kind of an academic experience. So how can they, you know, how do you find that or create the kind of world where that is more common than it is?
I know I tried to do it. So my daughter had a Facebook page, so then I thought, well, maybe I'll create one. So I created one, but she wouldn't be my friend, so I found my own friends. And then you know, musicians, artists, you know, and so then we would be talking, and then they'd be like, whoa, back off, professor, slow down, I'm just the dumb bass player. And so we try to have these conversations, but they were pretty one or two exchanges, and then they punt or tell me just, you know, that's enough, I don't want it anymore. But I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure you could use these social networking tools as a way to do it. I apparently don't know how to yet.
I just wanted to add just a little bit. Jackson is a really interesting community because we have so many organizations that are trying to foster that. What the library does, the Humanities Council, so many organizations have very interesting lectures, and there are 1,000 book groups. And it ends up often being almost that paradox of too many choices. We end up scattering people with interesting opinions and points of view into these pods of conversation where often people sort of agree. You know, you're attracted to the same people. I think if anywhere it can happen in Wyoming, Jackson should be able to continue this type of thing. And I know with Saturday U, this is a 3 times a year event. And I'm with Central Wyoming College, and I hope to foster more of that type of thing also in other forms. But there is a lot here. And it sometimes just takes, we all have to take the time to relax and disengage and say, I'm going to go to this place where there's this lecture. Relax, listen, and participate.
I want to interject on that too, because I went over to whisper to Susan earlier on this exact topic, saying that although we love having you, we really love having you, we don't have to have you to have a monthly discussion on something current. And I work with Susan through CWC as well, and there's no reason why, if there weren't an interest, that we could have a regular gathering of people who just want to talk about this esoteric stuff that makes you think. So she told me to come in and talk with her next week.
Did I see another hand over here? Yes.
I wanted to sort of share an idea, and I actually am an entrepreneur and a visiting professor back east on entrepreneurialism. And I show up kind of dressed like this, which they are already waiting. However cold it is. But I was thinking that the questions that that America is almost like when my grandparents came here. They came, they did not know the language, whatever job skills they came with is like, not useless, but whatever. And they had to learn the language and find a job, take care of their families, and create social networks that blah, 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 blah. And I kind of look at today's kids who are looking for jobs. They don't have to learn English, but they have to learn French, Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin. To learn, it's like the same challenge of using their IQ with creativity, but learning different languages. And I often have been interested in what makes people survive. And I've come to believe, and it's just my opinion, that survival and creativity often go hand in hand. I know for me it is as an entrepreneur. We created another company Friday. Why? we need more money. I'd love to give a really esoteric, wonderful answer, but that's it. And I think, or I wondered, have you run across any studies where creativity and survival are being studied together?
Now, the question is, what is, just to reduce that nice
Please.
comment to one sentence, is there any studies, evidence about the question of whether there's a link between being creative and surviving, or the pressure that surviving gives to being creative?
I would say that's the entire discipline of economics. Scarcity-driven choices.
Blind demand.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and triggering new technologies and economic growth, and the idea that we can make the economic pie bigger because we all want more than we can give. That's economics in a nutshell.
Thank you.
If you believe in evolution, you might argue that the existence of our species is evidence for the proposition that you're advancing, that creativity is a tool for survival.
Integral. I think so.
Any other questions? Are we running towards overload and surfeit? Okay, well then I will say thank you all very much for being such a wonderful audience.